Hello! Today's video is about this book, EH Carr's What is History? It was actually delivered as a series of lectures in 1961, so really quite a long time ago now, but I think it's still really relevant and really useful to read if you're thinking of applying to do history at university. Having said that, I probably wouldn't put it on your personal statement because nearly everybody does, but it's very useful to think about the ideas raised in it. So the video is about EH Carr, but it's also about the current controversy that's raging about tearing down statues, whether this is a case of erasing our history, as some people say it is, and it's also about Michael Gove and his attempt to rewrite the national curriculum for history in 2013. So what unites all these topics? Well, basically there's one central question here, and it's a question which EH Carr raises in the very first chapter of his book, or the first of his lectures, and that is, how objective is the study of history? Is it possible, he asks us, to think of a time when we can get to the truth about something in history, when historians, by burying themselves in the archives, by studying the documents really conscientiously, by accumulating all the relevant information, can somehow come to a version of the past that will then be not contestable, which will then be agreed about by everyone. And this was very much the 19th century's view. So 19th century thinkers had that confidence that given enough study, given enough time, enough documents, historians could reach the truth of what Leopold von Ranke described as wie es eigentlich gewesen, how it actually was. So how it actually was in the past. So this is the central question really of chapter 1 of this book. And EH Carr deals with it in a very pacey, very interesting series of reflections about history. And he begins by asking, what is a historical fact? In fact, the title of the first chapter of this book is called The Historian and His Facts. Now, I'm afraid we're going to have to bear with Professor Carr on writing out half of the human race here in terms of their potential to do history, because of his use of his. It's dated, the style is a little bit archaic, but the ideas are very interesting, so we'll temporarily forgive him for talking about his facts. So in a nutshell, what EH Carr does in this lecture is he completely demolishes the 19th century confidence in the idea that you can reach perfect objectivity or perfect truth in the study of history. And he does this by demonstrating that there's subjectivity at every level of the process of studying history. So at every level, the historian's own preferences, own judgment, own interpretations, own ability to select come into play, right from the outset. So when we decide what questions are worth asking of the past, right up until when the historian tries to package or present his or her views to the public in the language that the historian chooses, there is, at every level of this process, subjectivity. So EH Carr is very much arguing against the notion that history can be objective. So EH Carr asks the question, what is a historical fact? And he begins to answer it by a very famous example that he uses, which is that of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Now this, in case you're not familiar with classical history, this occurred in 49 BC. It was when Julius Caesar crossed the river Rubicon, which was the beginning of a great civil war which led to him becoming dictator and the beginnings of imperial Rome. So it was a huge turning point in history and has gone into our language as being as a saying that we use when the point of no return has been reached. So a drastic a line has been crossed. You can say that, you know, the Rubicon has been crossed. But what EH Carr says about this is that, you know, this is a fact of history that Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC. But what about all the other people in history who've crossed over that particular river? There have been so many people in history that have crossed that particular river at different times. those people's crossing of the Rubicon is not a fact of history, but Caesar crossing the Rubicon is one of the great facts of history that presumably everybody should know. So he uses this as an example of how an event, a little piece of data that has occurred in the past isn't necessarily a fact of history unless it's seized upon by historians, selected by historians, and a good case is made for its significance to something that is judged significant in the past. And he, very famously, he says, "It used to be said that facts speak for themselves. This is, of course, untrue. The facts only speak when the historian calls on them. It is he who decides to which facts to give the floor and in what order or context." So this is a very powerful argument for the inherent subjectivity of our very notion of what a fact of history is. EH Carr also talks about what he calls the processing of the so-called facts of history, and he uses a very good example of this to show how much subjectivity there really is in what pieces of information end up being regarded as the facts of history. And the example he uses is that of Gustav Stresemann. You might have studied him at GCSE if you did the Weimar Republic. He was foreign minister for the Weimar Republic in the interwar years in Germany. And when he died in 1929, his friends and family did a big effort to archive all his papers. There were boxes and boxes of his papers. And because they were his friends and family, they were very keen to preserve those elements of his work that had been most successful. So we remember Stresemann mostly for his work with foreign policy, bringing about reconciliation with the French, the Locarno treaties, for example, re-establishing Germany as a responsible power on the world stage after the First World War. And this was very much to do with the sort of Western-looking part of his foreign policy, when in actual fact, the bulk of his papers and much of his time was devoted to his the Eastern-facing part of his foreign policy, his dealings with the Soviet Union. And because that aspect of his work was far less successful, his friends and relations did not preserve as many of those papers as they did of the other half of his foreign policy, the Western side of his foreign policy, and that's very much influenced those documents that have been preserved and that historians have had to delve into when they've looked in the archives and researched Stresemann. So it's very much influenced the reputation of Stresemann in later years. And you may be able to think of similar examples of this from the history that you've studied. I have a particular favourite example from 19th century American history. That's involving this book, which is the letters of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Now, you may have watched the film Glory. I confess I'm a big fan of the film Glory. I think it's a fantastic film, and I think it's done a great service to public history by bringing to attention the experience of African Americans in the American Civil War, especially as soldiers, which was something that was sorely neglected. But I have to say that the portrayal of Robert Gould Shaw in that film is extremely distorted. It's very inaccurate. If you read the actual letters of Shaw that the film was based on. And there are various reasons for this, and you can see the process of selectivity, or being selective at every level of this process. So for a start, Robert Gould Shaw wrote a lot of letters to his parents, but also to many of his friends. His parents were ardent abolitionists, so they were campaigners for the ending of slavery and for racial justice in the United States. And they were extremely proud of him having taken on the leadership of the 1st Black Regiment of the US Army in the American Civil War. Now, when Robert Gould Shaw took this on, he was actually doing it slightly reluctantly, having refused to do it at first and having his arm twisted by his parents. He also wrote in a very different style when he wrote to his mother from the style he adopted when he wrote to his friends. Those of you who have watched the film will be very sad and disappointed to know that he actually used the N-word from time to time in letters to his friends. He would never have used that word in letters to his mother. But when he was killed during the assault on Fort Wagner in the Civil War, his mother was desperate to preserve his memory. She had a selection of the letters that he wrote her published, and obviously those have been further selected when it was made into a Hollywood film, and Robert Gould Shaw was made into a kind of a great hero figure. I'm not necessarily saying that there wasn't something heroic about Robert Gould Shaw. I think the real Robert Gould Shaw did have certain heroic qualities, but I think he was whitewashed to a very large extent by the film, and some of the complexities and maybe the immaturities, maybe the racism, to put it bluntly, that existed for him in his mental outlook was completely erased out of it in the film. So that would be my example of selectivity at every level in the historical process. So EH Carr shows that it's impossible to do history, if you like, without a large element of selection, of subjectivity, of the predilections and biases and concerns of the historian coming very much into view. And you can see this if you ask yourself the question, historians start by regarding something in the past as worthy of study. Why do they choose certain things as being worthy of study and other things as not being worthy of study? And how has this shifted over time? So all pieces of historical research start with an initial question. Some of the questions that we ask of the past now are questions that 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago would have seemed irrelevant. So, for example, I'm going to have to return to the American Civil War here because it's a good example, but if you look sort of 50, 60 years ago, if you'd studied the American Civil War in any universities, it would really have been a matter of studying battle tactics, of military strategy, some high politics, but a lot of the questions that we now look at, that we now consider to be important, were just completely overlooked. Things like the experience of the enslaved people, their role in their own emancipation. Things like the role of women on the home front in the Confederacy, for example. These are questions that just weren't considered part of American Civil War studies until reasonably recently. And there are whole swathes of history that just didn't exist 50 years ago. For example, we didn't study any LGBT history at all. It just wasn't considered history. Gender history is also a very recent in the kind of broader sweep of historical study sense of the term. So all these questions are now considered worthy of study, whereas 50 years ago they weren't. This is a lot to do with who are the historians in the universities doing the research, and what society values, what society considers important. The recent television series by David Olusoga, which features Black British history, is all about this. It's about uncovering a history that has always existed but has never been valued or has never really been prominent in what we've thought of as being history. So starting from the very first questions we ask before we embark on any kind of research, there's subjectivity going on. There's the historical questions that we ask are a reflection of what matters to us in the present. And then, of course, there's the documents that survive and how they've come to survive. There's how we interpret those documents, what weight we put on certain phrases within, for example, a piece of legislation or somebody's speech. There's thousands of acts of selection in any historical piece of research. And then there's the fact that historical research is mediated through usually the written word, and EH Carr makes this point very eloquently that by the fact that we are dependent on language to mediate our theories about history and our conclusions about history, we are of necessity going to be subjective. So the way we choose the words we choose, the phrases we choose to talk about historical figures, for example, will give a certain spin on them, will give a certain sense of subjective judgment. So there's no part of the historical process that is in any sense immune from subjectivity. So this is EH Carr's basic argument, and I'll end my discussion of him by reading you the final sentence of EH Carr's first chapter, his first lecture. My answer, therefore, to the question, what is history, is that it is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. So ever since about the 1960s or 70s, Carr's insights have been basically accepted by a broad consensus of the academic community. No serious historians would ever or have ever since then claimed to be writing perfect objective history, claimed to have arrived at the definitive truth, and nobody has talked about the facts of history as though they were in some sense sacred and written on tablets of stone and unchangeable. Instead, historians have always spoken in the last decade, since the 1960s really, as though what they're doing is part of an ongoing debate. They're feeding into an ongoing debate that when new evidence appears and is interpreted in different ways, conclusions that seem to be plausible would perhaps be re-evaluated and reinterpreted, and that's the essence and that's the joy of history. And that has generally been the consensus. And you can see this in the GCSE reforms. So when GCSE was brought in, there was a huge step away from rote learning of facts, and the whole idea of the essential subjectivity of history was absolutely at the core of the new GCSE, with its emphasis on source work, its emphasis on source criticism, its emphasis on different interpretations and argument, rather than just regurgitating the 10 different causes of World War I or whatever happened to be on the syllabus at the time. So all of that was a given really for many years. Then in 2013, Michael Gove, who was then Education Secretary, caused a lot of controversy by producing a draft history curriculum, a new national curriculum for history, which seemed to be completely stepping away from this approach. He criticised history teachers for being anti-knowledge, for neglecting to teach facts and instead only concentrating on skills, as though the two were separable. And his syllabus was absolutely packed with factual detail and would have left very little time for any kind of source criticism or discussion or debate. There was very much of an emphasis on rote learning. A lot of the supporters of Gove put great emphasis on this, and one of them, Chris Skidmore, he accused history teachers of being anti-knowledge, and there was a huge flare-up, a huge controversy about this whole curriculum, which in the end was abandoned. Presumably though, even if you've only come some of the way with EH Carr in terms of accepting his arguments, I would say that you should instantly be thinking, okay, so this new curriculum stepped away from interpretation and subjectivity and was putting the emphasis much more on these facts. But who had chosen these facts? Where did these facts come from? What was the process of selection involved in classing certain pieces of information, certain areas of history as the facts that children had to know who were studying the national curriculum? And if you looked at the curriculum that was proposed, then, well, the facts of history, as defined by Mr. Gove and his supporters, were very political, very much to do with kings and queens and battles, and not much women's history at all. Women were basically written out. Absolutely no black history. Very much emphasis on military history, provided that it went well for Britain. For example, the Opium Wars were completely left out. It was not an edifying episode in Britain's past. So I think you get the general picture that this was a very selective group of the so-called facts of history that were going to be fed to children without any of that sense of giving them the tools to interrogate those facts, to question the interpretations that they were being given. So no wonder it caused a great amount of controversy. And as I said, in the end, that curriculum was abandoned in favour of a much more balanced one with a lot more time to instill skills and teach ways of interrogating versions of the past that children were being presented with. So there was a great deal of controversy in the press over Michael Gove's attempted rewrite of the curriculum, and that was in 2013. And then the whole issue of public history went quite quiet for a few years. But as we know, recently it has had a resurgence in the press, and this has really come from the Black Lives Matter movement and the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, and the wider debate about statues and whether by removing statues we are in some sense erasing or rewriting our past. So I think that EH Carr and probably the vast majority of history academics would say that rewriting history is what we always do. It's necessary and it's wholly positive. If history is an unending dialogue between the past and the present, then it's no wonder that our priorities shift and our interpretations shift and our decisions about what is worth commemorating, what is worth studying, in what way we should commemorate events and people in the past. It's no wonder that all of this shifts over time, and it's wholly to the good. If you imagine the world at the time when that Edward Colston statue was put up in Bristol, 1895, this was a world in which the history people studied in schools was completely different, in which, women couldn't vote. This was an entirely different world than the world we live in today. So it's no wonder that our decisions then about who it was a good idea to commemorate were different from what they would be today. But coming back to EH Carr and subjectivity, I think probably the most troubling question that arises from EH Carr's analysis, persuasive though it is the question of whether, if everything is subjective in history, right from the questions we pose and the way we use our sources to the way we formulate theories and package them to the public, then I think, is there a temptation to argue, does anything go? Is any interpretation as good as any other interpretation? Is there any way of deciding between rival interpretations, or are they all just equally valid? And this is a question that I'm going to return to soon in a video on postmodernism.